Hi. My name is Yvette. I work in the Adult Programs Department here at Rogers Memorial, along with Pat and Joanna, who are also in the audience today, and we are happy to have all of you here. We're very happy to have a special guest with us, Brooke Kroeger. But before we introduce her, I'd like to say a little about David Alpern. David Alpern reviews books for the East Hampton Star and often brings their authors to local libraries like ours. So we're really thankful to him for that. Prior to that, he reported, wrote, or edited at the pre-Murdoch New York Post, the Daily Journal of Elizabeth, New Jersey, United Press International, and for more than 40 years at Newsweek magazine. For more than 30 years there, he also ran the weekly Newsweek On Air network radio show, which he later took independent and nonprofit as For Your Ears Only. And that's still available online. While at Newsweek, too, on March 16, 1970, David was present for the great turning point when young female researchers at the magazine filed suit under the Equal Employment Opportunity Act for the same assignments, pay, titles, and respect enjoyed by young male journalists there. Very cool. The settlement they won helped accelerate woman power throughout print, broadcast, and subsequent online news platforms, as David will discuss, along with many other milestones with today's guest speaker, Brooke Kroeger, author of Undaunted, How Women Changed American Journalism. Please welcome David Alpern.
Thank you, Yvette. Thanks to all joining us live or on YouTube to hear Brooke Kroeger talk about Undaunted, How Women Changed American Journalism, copies of which will be available for sale and signing after we finish here with your questions and comments at the Rogers Memorial Library in Southampton. The uneven progress of women in the workforce is such an important topic that research on the topic won this year's Nobel Prize in Economics. And Ms. Kroeger is very much part of the dramatic transformation about which she writes. For more than a decade at home and abroad, she was a correspondent, editor, bureau chief, and division head for United Press International. She covered the United Nations for Newsday and was deputy metropolitan editor for the late lamented New York Newsday. At NYU later, Professor Kroeger was founding director of the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute. Her previous 5 books include a biography of daredevil reporter Nellie Bly, about whom she will say more shortly, and The Suffragettes, How Women Used Men to Get the Vote. With all that as background, Ms. Kroeger. Brooke.
I'm here.
Thanks for taking us inside Undaunted.
My pleasure.
It seems we've sat and talked about this before.
We have done that.
About the time this book came out, the elevation of 2 female executives at CNN meant that women now directed or co-directed every major U.S. news network. And we all see the profusion of female news and talk TV anchors, correspondents, also print writers, columnists, and editors. So what's the latest estimate on the percentage of women throughout U.S. journalism today, and why have you said the growing numbers make you a little nervous?
I can't tell you the exact percentage, but I know that if you follow the news about this, you'll notice that there will be grids of 12 women, all of whom are CEOs or editors of the major publications and broadcast outlets. When Kristen Welker took over Meet the Press recently, she made a point of saying how many women were running programs of this nature. And having done the work I have done, tracing the path of women at the top of the profession, not all women, but women at the top of the profession and not in all avenues. I'm making a point of emphasizing this. It's about the women who are at the top of the profession in legacy media, in mainstream known media, places where women did not find easy welcome, places where men were always in charge and didn't make it easy. So that's who the book is about. I have to make this little digression because this comes off so often. In various discussions of the book, people will say, but what about so-and-so? You know, but why isn't so-and-so? I'm thinking, first of all, the book has to be representative because there have been tons of women since the 1840s. And I picked the stories that kind of spoke to every decade. So it wasn't, there was just no intention of being inclusive, even though a lot of people I would have liked to keep in, I couldn't just for space. And to keep the narrative under 400 pages is really a trick covering 180 years. So hold your whatabouts. That's sort of how I feel about that. Or it doesn't include the activist. It doesn't include advocacy media, you know, where there are some major stars. But the book is about the people who were doing jobs that men would envy doing. That is kind of a crass way of speaking about who's in the book. So back to your question, why does this make me nervous? Because one thing about doing a continuum, which I had never done before, I've done segments of history, like Nellie Bly's life, and we'll talk about that in a while, which goes from 1864 to 1922. You know, your tendency is to focus very closely on that era, that period of time, and maybe a little bit before and a little bit after. So you never have the whole picture the way you do if you're going systematically 1840, 1850, 1860, 1870, all the way to the present, which is what I've done in this case. And the pattern that you see, I'm sorry about the long way of getting to the point, but the pattern that you see is every time women surge, like in wartime, when men have gone off to war, so positions open, or when in times like this, you see women surging. Why? Because the industry is falling apart. And that's the sad part. Even as early as the 1930s, there would be instances of a woman becoming a city editor at a major metropolitan daily. I mean, it was almost unheard of at the time, so of course it would be news. And what would happen within 18 months? The publication would fail. So you can always see that there was this kind of last gasp, Hail Mary pass attitude about putting women in charge. Now, one would really hope that's not what's happening right now, that this really is a reflection of burgeoning equality, but I just saw it too many times along the path to be sure that that's the case. So that's why I get a little nervous.
We see what's happened to broadcast television and news, and we hear what's happening even to cable as the internet eats up everything. So we will keep our fingers crossed. And we'll get back to that. Which would you say is women's greater contribution to American journalism over the decades? Is it powerfully demonstrating that they could do the jobs as well as men or even better, really embodying the notion of equality? Or is it adding a unique perspective that makes journalism better, broader, more engaged, more engaging?
So the great answer to that is both. Both are true. Both are absolutely true. Women having up against some pretty significant odds, often, especially attitudes, ingrained attitudes. Women didn't have the intellectual power to be a journalist, except at the lowest levels, covering society and fashion and things like that. I mean, there was a sense that women couldn't go beyond that. That was a convenient assessment because men didn't want to do those jobs. So when those became interesting avenues of the profession because of the advertising that it was bringing in, department stores, you know, elixirs, you know, all sorts of things like that, you had to have copy to fill those spaces, and men didn't want to cover society. They really didn't want to do gossip. They didn't want to do those things. So having women coming to the fore around 1860, that became a plus, and then keeping them there became even more important, even though many were jumping at the bit to get out of those ghettos. So the question is, how did they improve things? So they got opportunities slowly, but I think in the 1880s is one point where you can see a change with something that was known as an era that was known as the stunt girl or detective reporting. And this would be young women, attractive, full of daring do, who would, you know, go down in a diving bell, up in a balloon, things like that. But there were a few standouts who really did something I would consider a precursor to serious investigative reporting, even in this kind of frivolous format that was called stunt reporting. So that would be Nellie Bly, who's the subject of my first book, And she, is very well known for only 2.5 years of her life, though her life is fantastic if you ever want to read a great story. But these 2.5 years start with her getting committed to a lunatic asylum on Blackwell's Island, which is now Roosevelt Island. It used to be the home of all the cancer spots of modern Manhattan, the almshouses, the prisons, the insane asylums, etc. And she got herself committed as a person in need, a mental need, and investigates for 10 days and then writes this extraordinary expose that really, really makes her a star. And over the next 2.5 years, week after week after week, she was doing these sorts of exposés of, bribery artists in Albany, the baby buying trade, I mean, just myriad things like this. And then she ends it with her lightning 72-day trip around the world, faster than the fictional record of Phileas Fogg in Around the World in 80 Days. So she was a phenomenon, and she was Beyonce of journalism. And not too long before and not too long after, we have two very serious investigative reporters in the two Idas. Ida B. Wells on lynching, who did work that was beyond exemplary, and Ida Tarbell, breaking up the monopoly in oil in the Rockefeller trusts. And what's interesting about those two women, well, what's interesting, there's a lot of things interesting about all three of them because they're not so far apart in age, and yet I could find no evidence that any of them knew each other or talked about each other. There's like one point in Ida Tarbell writing about women in journalism and what it takes to be one, where she really kind of takes a swipe at Nellie. She says something like, if you want to write journalism, you need to spend your dowry getting an education in political economy, as she had done. She'd gone to the Sorbonne, really serious. And her work was documented, as Ida B. Wells's work was documented. These were two educated women. Nellie Bly finished school at, I think, 8th or 9th grade for a lot of reasons, but didn't go on with schooling after she was 14. So that would be, 9th, 10th grade, something like that. These two were college educated and really developed the idea of investigative reporting that was based in fact. Nellie's work was, I am there, you can believe me. It had a much stronger narrative quality, but the power of facts, is just indisputable. And so I'm sure you both, these stories of the two Idas, as I like to call them. And I think that would be an interesting thing to do, is to put the three of them together and watch how they develop this really important journalistic form, which I think they did.
There's a fourth name that stands out in the early eras of your book. In 1840, Margaret Fuller,
Oh, yes.
already famous for her conversations about literature and art for the women around Boston, was named the first editor of The Dial, a quarterly magazine launched by the poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, with whom and his wife she had tirelessly campaigned to ingratiate herself. Talk more about Fuller, her accomplishment, especially her 1843 essay, The Great Lawsuit, which so caught the attention of New York Tribune founder and editor Horace Greeley and his wife.
I think she's remarkable because she's the first down the pike of mainstream journalism for a woman who is achieving like a guy. She is a master networker, and I found this was true of just about every woman who ever succeeded in journalism. They are master networkers, all of them. And so she starts that. She is so interested in Ralph Waldo Emerson. She has what I call a mad intellectual crush on the man, and she is trying every way she can to get to know him. She has someone send a thesis of hers, an unpublished thesis, for him to read. She goes to events that he might be present at. This is all in her diary. I mean, it's kind of amazing. Finally, his wife makes an invitation for her to come spend a fortnight at their home in the suburban Boston area. And she does this, and he is not inclined to like her. He's just not. But she wins him over. She's homely. She has some very irritating tics, like she just bats her eyes all the time, and while she speaks, and she is disdainful of other women, she's thought to be a little bit, but he is overtaken by her. And in the meantime, she is doing something called the Conversations, as David mentioned, and these were events that she arranged, first in a friend's bookstore and then in other venues, where she is trying to bring women into understanding how to systematize knowledge. Because women, at that point, even if they're being schooled, are going to charm school. I mean, they're not really getting a sophisticated intellectual education. So that's her idea, that she would help to train women of her background. Her father was brilliant, he was a congressman, and he really trained her in Greek and Latin. I mean, she had a very sophisticated education. And so she becomes friends with the Emersons, and he starts the Dial, this intellectual journal out of Boston, and appoints her the first editor. And so that's how she gets her start in journalism, by networking. I mean, really, it's networking. And one of her fans is Horace Greeley's wife, Mary. And they're transcendentalists, as they all are, and Mary is encouraging Horace to come with her down to hear the conversations because she is enamored of Margaret. Yes. So what happens? She convinces Horace to make her the literary editor of the New York Tribune, the most successful, largest circulation paper in the country, not just in New York. And so she takes that job and succeeds in that job, interestingly, with headaches, vapors, never making a deadline. And he is, you know, in a newspaper universe, it's extraordinary that he was excusing this behavior, but he did. Not only that, Mary invited her to live in their home. So she lived there with them, and Greeley could see how she mesmerized everyone who came to visit. I mean, she just had this extraordinary pull, even being homely and off-putting. It kind of didn't matter. You know, there was this kind of surpassing genius about her. After a very short time, she's doing culture, literature, you know, writing about things like that. And then come January, this is like maybe 6-8 weeks into her tenure, she decides she wants to cover the underside of New York. So she is going through the charitable institutions to evaluate what sort of thing is being done towards the underclasses. I mean, again, this is like everything any journalist would ever want to do. And then after 2 years, she decides she's going to go to Europe and take a different relationship to the paper, probably by the piece instead of on, you know, a monthly contract. And she gets caught up in the Italian Revolution and is covering that and also helping. And then her story has an extraordinary and tragic end that I'll let you read in the book or read about Margaret Fuller, but she's dead by the age of 40 on her way back to the United States in a shipwreck right off Fire Island. Anyway, it's a great story. I just want to say another thing, that she and Lydia Maria Child fascinated me in that period. And Lydia Maria Child, for another way she found to get women into things. Like if you were reading Margaret Fuller's story, which you could easily do 50 years later because she would be on any list of the most important women in America. I mean, she had that kind of draw, not only in her own period, but for decades and decades after. And for journalists, that just doesn't happen very much. You know, remember, journalism is ephemera. It's meant to disappear tomorrow. Like, people shouldn't get upset that there's no legacy about all these people, because there's no legacy about the men either. I mean, only really, really exceptional people get to have a legacy that has longevity. So Lydia Maria Child was writing household hints, you know, how girls should behave, and then biographies of important women, you know, very, very women's fare. And wants to break out of that at a certain point, but well into her career. I mean, she's 8 years older than Margaret Fuller. And she figures out that her passion about abolition and writing for the abolition press was going to make a difference. So she's doing the work she would have done for anybody, but she's doing it through the abolition press. Well, why were women getting opportunity in the abolition press? Why? Because they didn't have any money. So they're more open to having other writers, to looking beyond, you know, white men, basically. They're looking way beyond that for people with talent. You don't really look, you know, if it's not broke, why fix it, kind of thing. Not happening. So she makes her new reputation that way. She writes a very important treatise on what should happen to the class of Americans called Africans that promoted ideas that were not common at the time, including intermarriage. I mean, she had it all out there. It destroys her career for a decade. She was one of America's most popular kind of common sense, you know, women's writers, and suddenly she is blackballed by everybody. And it takes a decade to reestablish her reputation, even for some of her perennials. So she's not the last one to use the abolition press that way. And I don't mean use it, but I mean to find that that's a way in to get your work out there. So in the 1860s, Grace Greenwood, Gail Hamilton, these long forgotten names, do something very, very similar, and they end up living in the home of Gamaliel Bailey in Washington, very much like Margaret Fuller did. You can see how, you know, I can't say for sure that they picked up on the models, but it seems like people got the idea that these were ways to advance. And so that happens. And then we get to the 1880s, where we were talking about Nellie and the Idas, and what else?
Well, we mentioned war, and sad to say it was also a factor in advancing gender equity in journalism, and not only by opening jobs previously filled by men who had to go into service. So talk about first the cadre of women who went to cover World War I on assignment or freelance, including Nellie Blount.
Okay, I'll do that. First, I'd like to say about the women going to war that women at home who took those jobs, what happened to them afterwards, especially World War I and World War II. So many were really not up to it. They were really filling the jobs because there was nobody else. And they either found their way into marriage or other fields, and they would leave. And then a certain contingent remained, small but potent. And there were many more of them than people really know, for the same reason I said before, that journalists get forgotten. It's kind of part of being a journalist. So of those who went abroad, we could start with World War I, where there were many more than you would think. And it seems to me, even going back to the late 1890s, with the Spanish-American War and the war in the Philippines and Greece, as near as we can tell, if the you know, X number of men were off as foreign correspondents, 10% were women. And that figure remained, you know, probably up to Vietnam. After that, women become half or more, and then sometimes even more, as you see now. Like, women's bylines are all over war coverage. And that's a huge change. But even in the early period, 10%, when you consider what they were over against, is pretty remarkable. So Nellie ends up covering, the only woman covering the Eastern Front during World War I. Gertrude Atherton, other novelists, Edith Wharton, all went to do kind of war series for the Saturday Evening Post and other magazines. Mary Roberts Reinhardt. I mean, there was, you know, that was kind of a celebrity war coverage thing that was going on with some very, very good writers. So that was happening. There were other husband and wife teams who were photographer, writers working for Leslie's. In Nellie's case, her big journalism career was pretty much over for a number of reasons. She had married a man 40 years her senior who was an industrialist, and she basically takes over his companies and then gets herself in a whole lot of hot water, including legal hot water. And so she is fleeing the country to Austria to a friend, and leaves in August of 1914, so I guess about her timing was a little off, and ends up being an enemy alien ultimately. But in those first days, because she's in Austria, and she is the first woman who goes on a trip to the front and does some extraordinary coverage. But again, she just turned it into a war assignment. It wasn't why she went initially. And then on her way back, she stops at Versailles in 1919 when the treaty is being negotiated, and is trying to convince Wilson's lieutenants that the Bolsheviks are coming and they really need to get prepared, and they're not paying enough attention to what's happening, and they just dismiss her as a hatty old lady. And almost don't let her back into the country because she's been in enemy territory for 4 years and not really sure what her sympathies are, but finally decide that she's hatty, and then they let her back in. It's kind of a sad part of her story, but she did some great coverage while she was there. And then we can talk about the World War II women who did some really basic things.
I wanted to talk about Dorothy Thompson and
McCormick. Okay, so they
were... That starts getting us into the more modern.
Okay, so they don't do war coverage, either of them. They're diplomatic correspondents, they're analysts, they are amazing. Anne O'Hare McCormick wins the first Pulitzer Prize won by a woman in 1937. This is 20 years after the prize was established. 20 years. There had been women who'd won for poetry or for fiction, but not for journalism.
Nor, we have to say,
years.
Without being nominated.
He's getting up my scoops. David. Yeah, how she gets the prize, I think, is an interesting story that I did fish out and was not previously known. So, yes, she was not nominated by the Times, which is shocking. But anyway, a fact. And then after her, it's another till 1951. So how many years is that? Somebody do the math. 14.
But I have to finish. I know it's.
I will. I'll do it. And so Dorothy Thompson was remarkable. She was a suffragist. She makes her way to Europe to make a career. In 6 months, she establishes herself as a very effective foreign correspondent. She works for NANA, North American Press Association, and then gets a job with the Philadelphia Ledger as their Berlin correspondent, which is really kind of the chief European correspondent, which was amazing in the 30s. She gets herself hauled out of Germany because she says something awful about Hitler. But she's so important that by 1943, I think it is 43, but early 1940s, she's important enough to have a profile in the same year, both in the Saturday Evening Post, very middlebrow, and the New Yorker, both of which ran 2 issues. How many 2-issue profiles have you ever seen? Just to give you a sense of who she was, and how I choose who the women are who are in the book. I mean, when has that happened? And to whom? I mean, you have to kind of think about that. She had that kind of reach and importance. And of course, she was married to Sinclair Lewis, and there's a whole lot going on there. But she's a really remarkable figure and very important in the book. She didn't win a Pulitzer, though.
But you have to go back and explain how Anne O'Hare McCormick won the Pulitzer Prize without being nominated.
Okay, now I have to give it up now? Okay. Okay, so this is how it happened. And this is, over against Arthur Kroc, who's the Washington bureau chief, who really thinks he needs to win the Pulitzer every year. You can see it in the letters he's writing to the publisher. It's just sort of shocking. Something that Anne O'Hare McCormick never does. Also, we have to mention that for 14 years, Adolph Ochs made her remain a stringer for the paper. This is even after she, cites Mussolini and figures out he's going to be a power. I mean, she had that kind of depth of understanding of what she was witnessing in Europe. And she was just a stringer for 14 years. He dies, and his successor is his son-in-law, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, who makes her a columnist, gives her a place on the editorial board, and the next year she wins the prize. So you think, oh, that's fantastic. And then they nominate her, right? Because that should have happened 14 years earlier, practically, when she did the Mussolini coverage. But no. So I start digging into this, and first I'm looking at how it's being promoted in the paper. And I look 5 years earlier and 5 years after to see what the headline is and what the subhead is, how do they put it together. And the headline always is the Broadway show or the novel, always, no matter who it is. And then if the Times has a winner, it's in italics in the second line or in non-italics, whatever the opposite is. And in her year, there's no mention of it. And I think, this is the first woman journalist to win a prize. Why aren't they making that why isn't that a sidebar? Like, why isn't that there? Couldn't figure it out. And then I'm reading through the text, and there's kind of one line before the jump that mentions, it was the first woman. And there's just nothing about it. So I was able to get through the Pulitzer Committee some things that were not in the Columbia Library archives of the Pulitzers. And what we could determine from what we saw was that after the prizes were won, there is a memo from one department asking to get the packet, because for a Pulitzer Prize there's always a packet usually produced by whoever the nominator is, often, of course, the publisher. And the packet would have the articles, a letter of nomination, all that sort of thing. And there's no packet. And that particular year, the jury was made up of the Columbia professors who were designated, and they gave her the award by acclamation. And they said they used their own, files of the New York Times records that were always bound. So I thought that was pretty extraordinary.
Amazing.
Now you know.
World War II created more empty slots in journalism for women by then more than half of all newsroom employees, Plus there was respect and renown for some who were at or near the front. So talk a little bit about Martha Gellhorn on D-Day and Marguerite Higgins at the Dachau concentration camp.
Okay, Marguerite Higgins is more interesting for other things like the Korea War, but I will tell you about Martha Gellhorn. Everybody know Martha Gellhorn. See, that's a name that endures. And you have to ask, why do some names endure? Because her work endures. I think it's usually about the work. I have a digression on that. Will you ask me when I finish this so I don't lose my train of thought? But Martha Gellhorn, at the time, is married to you-know-who. Something she never liked to talk about very much, and she didn't like the way it got in the way of her own career. But she's writing for Collier's regularly, all the time, getting paid $1,000 an article. And she's been covering all over Europe. And then D-Day's approaching, and of course all the magazines are gearing up because this is going to be super important coverage. And they have one slot on the ships that are going in with the invading forces. And who do they give it to? Their faithful correspondent, Martha Gellhorn? Oh no, they give it to the husband she's about to divorce, that guy. So Ernest Hemingway. So that was, a source of a lot of unhappiness for Martha. But how does she deal with that? She stows away on a hospital ship with several nurses. She hides in the bathroom with her flask, stealing up her courage, and beats everybody there. Now, her story doesn't run till a month or two later because how long it takes magazines to get things into print in those days. But that tells you about Martha Gellhorn. The result of this extraordinary coverage was, that we still read, was to lose her credentials for the rest of the war, which also did not stop her. That means you lose rations, you lose places to sleep, you lose a whole lot of stuff. But she persisted. And then, who else did you want me to talk about?
Well, we're going to talk about Higgins at
Higgins, okay. Yeah, so Higgins, Marguerite Higgins is another great character, and there's a brand new biography that just came out a few days ago by Jeanette Conant, who I think is local, right?
Yes.
That's worth reading. This is really an extraordinary life. The book is called, I'm giving her a big plug, the book is called Fierce Ambition, and that is a pretty good description of Marguerite Higgins. Flora Lewis, who you might be familiar with, who was a columnist for the Times for a long time, also brilliant and distinguished woman. She and Maggie Higgins were the same age and both went to Columbia Journalism School at the same time. And Flora Lewis tells a story that one time, and this is just emblematic of Maggie Higgins, they all were given the same classroom assignment, and Maggie goes ahead of everybody and checks out every relevant book. And that is Maggie Higgins.
So they're not available.
Yeah, that is Maggie Higgins. That is the way she functioned. There's a point where one of her colleagues at the Herald Tribune, like at her paper, gets an assignment to interview the interim president of France. And Maggie convinces him that her French is better, which it is. She's the daughter of a French mother and grew up speaking French. And so he agrees to let her come, and then her story becomes the main story and his the sidebar. I mean, she just was not wonderfully collegial, but very effective, as Flora Lewis would say. And after Europe, so she's finally, like she's 26 and she gets appointed Berlin bureau chief after the war, which is, you know, astounding. Before she goes to Europe, she'd only been on the paper for 2 years. I mean, usually you have to be a journeyman, you know, before anybody's going to let you go overseas, but not Maggie. So she's in Berlin, and they decide to get her out of there, and they send her to Tokyo. And she's very unhappy about it, but kind of makes the most of it. And then, of course, Korea happens, and she's there on the front lines. But they have a more important war correspondent. They have Homer Biggert at the time, still at the Herald Tribune. And he is so not happy to have her there. And he's brave and fearless and a fantastic writer and the most admired of all the correspondents. But she is taking risks that no man will take. And he's having to match them because he has to. So putting her life in peril. And 6 people, I think, win the Pulitzer in 1951 for Korea. She is one of them. And when you read the citations, you know, you see this, you see the way the sexism works. So everybody else wins for their coverage, or, you know, there's some special thing about it. And in her case, it's basically for being a woman and taking those risks. It's pretty offensive because she really was incredibly brave.
We'll talk about offensive. You also confirmed what an old Newsweek hand who'd been in Korea then told me about the reaction of Homer Biggert to the news that Marguerite Higgins had gone home to have a baby.
Right. So another colleague, Betsy Wade, at the Times, who had been at the Herald Tribune with Homer Biggert and then also at the Times with him, had been following him and collecting notes about him, and finally asked him, so which did you say? Did you say, who's the mother? Or did you say, did she eat it? And he answered, yes. So that's how people saw her, but she was very effective. Now at Dachau, she and a Stars and Stripes reporter were first in, but she herself later says in a memoir that she learned from that experience, because remember, she was really young, that it wasn't always everything to be first, that it was more important what you actually wrote.
But the thing that stood out to me in your reporting of that is they were the first to enter Dachau before the fighting for it had actually ended.
Yeah.
I mean, it was the front line that they braved to get in there. I mean, it was not just showing up and saying, we're here. Was broadcasting, which has made war so much a part of our daily lives, from Korea, Vietnam, later Iraq, Afghanistan, an easier or more difficult medium for women, and who do you see among the groundbreakers, either in front of the camera or behind the mic or whatever?
So in World War II, of course, radio would have been the more important issue, and then of course in World War I, it didn't quite exist yet. I mean, commercial radio comes around 1922, so it would be later. David could certainly confirm that. But so radio would be it. And Edward R. Murrow, who was, you know, the doyen of radio correspondence during World War II, had a number of women working with him in some sort of stringer capacities. And then none of them are on his team when you get back to New York. So that tells you a lot. In the case of some of them, they had men obliged to read their copy over the air because the women's voice was not considered authoritative enough. So that was a big issue. And then we see later that the way that takes form in television is appearance, age, all these things become a factor for women in a really big way. So, you know, in some ways it's a little bit harder of a medium. On the other hand, television is done in teams, you know, producer, and there's so many people involved, which is a lot different than you and your notebook. Yes, there are editors and others along the way, but it's a much more, would you say, a much more collaborative form?
Well, and it also is the ladder, the part of the ladder that leads to top executive positions, not necessarily having been on camera and a celebrity, but doing the production work and knowing the insides and outs.
And often writing, often the writing. So I mean, it's hard to know, you know, what people do and don't do, but for women on the air. And then for black women, the hair issue, you know, was such a huge one really early. Does anybody remember Melba Tolliver?
Sure.
I mean, what a fantastic character. You know, there's a big Times profile of her, the toast of the town. And before that, to cover Tricia Nixon's wedding, she was assigned from, I think it's ABC, local ABC in New York, if I got that right. And she had just let her hair go natural, very tightly cropped, but natural. And her bosses said, either you wear a scarf or you change it back. And she declined, which was incredibly brave when you think about when that was. And she was completely cut out of all the coverage. But she survived that because somebody got that into the local press, into the gossip columns, and that really saved her. And then she goes on to have this, you know, really brilliant local career and a huge inspiration to many of my colleagues.
How important was it that journalism started moving from a trade or a craft to a profession populated by ever new generations of former college newspaper editors who were, unlike their predecessors, comfortable working with and for women?
Oh, that, you know, that training is a big thing and opportunity is a big thing. I think that is really true. In sports, I think we see this most dramatically. The first Cornell woman sports editor penetrates the Yale box. You know, I mean, all these things created possibility when you saw that happening. And the fact that they were able to do this in college meant that college men who might become professional athletes have already had the experience of women, you know, in their locker rooms or things like that. So change could start to happen. It was a very, very slow road. And I think it was a really, really long time before a woman could like do play-by-play of a football game or something like that. Those things came very late. So there were, you know, certain bastions that always were held apart. But women did find their way.
I see some poetic justice in the connection between early female journalism, focusing on inequality and injustice, and many of the later social reforms here, including the Equal Employment Opportunity Laws, which gave the women at Newsweek leverage for more gender equity in journalism. So talk more about that first great turning point that I got to witness.
I think you should talk about it, David. I really do, because you were there.
Well,
I mean, I just want to say this. It wasn't only Newsweek. There were 10 publications. Newsweek was first. Newsweek was first, but it's the New York Times, Washington Post, Washington Star, Detroit Free Press, Reader's Digest, Life, Look, Time. I mean, everybody got on that bandwagon. And the one thing I want to say about it, but then I'd like you to talk about Newsweek if you don't mind, because I've been talking a whole lot. That's okay. But is that the sad part is that it took women over 6 years to grasp that the equal opportunity legislation applied to them and could have been used as an instrument of creating change in their workplace. Like, it took 6 years to say, oh, us too. I mean, I can't quite get over that. That wasn't immediately apparent, which tells you how ingrained the subordination was, the feeling of, this is okay, that my parents were right, I shouldn't aspire to anything except marriage and family, and maybe work a little while to help with a down payment on a house, or you know, something like that. That was the accepted mentality. I mean, there had to be a revolution to understand that there was greater opportunity.
Well, it's interesting. Nora Ephron was only
Until 70, it's like legislation is 64, and it's not till 70 that this inkling happens, largely in response to the feminist revolution. I mean, it really did make a difference.
Nora Ephron was only hired by Newsweek to deliver mail and put newspapers, but later, as a writer at the New York Post, she told me that Newsweek was, quote, a hard place to leave. And what I've gathered from, you know, my female colleagues there is that, especially the situation at Newsweek, the researchers were so close to the news. They were really dealing with the copy. They were doing some reporting. And it was really very close. And it was hard to give up, even though they knew that there was a glass ceiling that they couldn't.
As one of my friends said, you were so close to the pulse of what was happening in the world. You know, you were above the fray of the masses who didn't know anything. You were hearing everything firsthand.
And working
almost.
on it, and checking stories, and having something.
It was very heady in a way. And the aspirations were light. They weren't really expecting to have long-term careers, a lot of them. So there was
in
that.
brief, the Women's Revolution did spark this realization that the Equal Opportunity Act could be employed by the women. And it was brought to a head the week that Newsweek published a cover story on the Women's Revolution.
So perfect.
And didn't find a woman on staff to write the story.
They had to,
So they gave the assignment to a friend of mine, Helen Dudar, who was a great writer and rewrite person at the New York Post, and the wife of a Newsweek senior editor, to write the story. So that on the Monday that Newsweek came out with its coverage of the Women's Revolution, the Newsweek women came out with a lawsuit.
And the two editorial assistants who were working with her, who were Newsday staffers, were really at the forefront of this group, but they did not, did I say something else? Newsweek staffers, but they did not let on what they were doing. They did not share it.
I have to say that with the approval of Katharine Graham, who was, of course, the publisher of Newsweek as well as the Washington Post, there was a settlement. And the settlement wisely included what we men there called the famous writers' school, where it was put into practice that you couldn't give these women simply the opportunity without giving them some more experience. I mean, they were familiar with the system, but writing Newsweek stories, which even many newspaper men didn't do very well.
Okay, but think about that for a minute.
So there were courses and practice, and we all, not all of us, but a number of us sort of contributed. How do you write a story? What are the 7 ways to write a lead that's interesting?
Okay, but why was that not happening to some of the people cited in the original suit, who were the men who were coming out of Columbia J School at the same time as young women, being hired together with identical CVs, and the men were hired as junior reporters or reporters, and the women to clip coupons. I mean, you know, to clip articles. I mean, so if you start there, why weren't you giving that training to those guys? I mean, think how off that is.
That's what the revolution was about. And that's
no, but I'm saying that if that's what was created, just think about that for a minute, that it was thought that that was needed for the women, but not for the men. These women who were Marshall scholars.
Well,
I mean,
they all had better connections than I did. I remember when I first got there, there was a story about, I think it must have been in Bush 1 presidency, there was a scandal over passports. And the woman at the State Department who ran the passport office, whose name was Knight or McKnight, I think it was Knight, Francis Knight. And we're standing around the Nation Department, how are we going to do a profile of this woman? And then one of the researchers, whose name was Frances Virgin, she always ordered from the coffee shop under a different name, just to avoid the jokes. She said, oh, my mother plays cards with her every Tuesday night. She's got this box and she can control every window in the house and that. I said, what am I doing here? I'm a kid from Brooklyn. I mean, these women are so great. But I think it was appreciated.
Questions?
I think it was appreciated that it wasn't just sink or swim. You have the right, go and use it. And
when you're saying that to me, and I hadn't heard that before, I'm offended. I'm offended because of the guys who didn't have to be put through primer school.
Well,
I mean, you learn a lot. Who does that? And in a newspaper, you learn from an editor. You learn working.
Or you get fired. You get hired by Newsweek on a 3-month trial, and they give you stories to write. And if you don't do it, they say, thank you very much.
Right. But I'm saying...
And like, so in this case, I disagree. I say I think it was very wise of the women to ask, and smart of the company to agree that, you know, while they knew this, this, and this, there are some tricks of the trade that made writing for a news magazine different than writing for a newspaper, and I think it was.
And the guys just knew that naturally.
No, they had a chance. They had their 3 months to get edited. Well, they had their 3 months to get edited and either learn it by doing it or go. And so rather than say, well, you didn't make it in 3 months, there was a little something extra. I'm sorry that it insults you. So we're reaching the end of the hour.
Yeah.
Before I start raising unmentionable questions, let's see if there are questions and comments from the audience. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, just what you were saying. Are you saying the women asked for the extra
Was
training?
part of the settlement.
Was part of the
There would
settlement.
be-
So it wasn't
Yeah.
necessarily that they wanted it.
I need to say that in 2010, so we're talking, what, 50 years later, there's a wonderful article that you can read by Jessica Bennett and two other women who were young reporters at Newsweek, who discovered Susan Brown Miller's book about this subject, and were shocked to realize that everything they were experiencing at Newsweek in 2010 was things that had been experienced in the late 1960s. So there was change, but change for women has always come very slowly. Institutional change takes a really long time. The book is full of that.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yeah, you talked about women journalists having to work harder, take more risks. I think of people like Marie Colvin, who's
Yeah, great.
admire, and on the print side, but then Christiane Amanpour and Lise Doucet and Orla Guerin and all these
Fantastic.
people you see that you almost can't even believe they're all still alive because of the risks they took.
But not unlike men. I mean, let's say that. Men doing war reporting do the same thing.
Yeah,
It just always seems surprising when women do it.
Well,
I wish it didn't.
not that so much, but you talked about today, women are at least 50%.
Or more.
Is it because there's sort of, a necessary tradition baked into it of women having to work harder than men, or it's expected now that they know to do that, or are they just finally getting the recognition they typically always?
I would guess it's a constellation of factors, that there's more opportunity for women now, both from legal actions that we've just spoken about. That's one reason. For another is it's a field in decline, so there's more opportunity for women when you're not the alpha, when it's not something that the alpha white males are wanting to do. Opportunity opens up for other groups. That happens. And it turns out they're good at it.
Yeah.
There's that too. So I think all of those things are true. I mean, that's just my opinion, but that's what I think.
And is it is it different? And I know there is still print journalism. Is it different on the print side? Is it more pronounced on television?
I think for I don't know this for a fact because I've never really done television reporting. I've done some radio, but not television. It's so much more complex with the equipment and the teams and all that stuff. I mean, I can remember taking audio equipment and hooking up phones to acoustic receivers in the middle of the Sinai Desert. I mean, when you only have a pencil, it's a whole lot easier, or a small typewriter that you could take with you, or a small CR-80 or something.
And it doesn't matter how your hair looks.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter. So, I think that's complexified for television in that sense, but the safety questions are all the same.
Mm-hmm.
The risks are terrible, and we should support those people who do that work.
Yeah. Thank you.
Anybody else?
If anyone has a question, just wait for me to bring the mic so that we can hear it since we're recording.
Thank you, Yvette.
Well, I have one last question.
She's got a question.
Oh, I will ask.
Wait.
Okay, I do have a question. I'm an immigrant. I came in 1966 to New York, so I don't know many of the writers, but I've heard of some of them. I'm just curious. How long did it take you to write the book? Because you seem to know every little detail. Do you have an assistant, somebody who helps you?
No, I've had the maybe 300 women who are not in the book. I had someone help me look those up to see if there's anybody I needed. But I would say the book took 60 years because I've lived this life, so a lot of it I know. I've written about parts of this earlier in my career, so certain segments of time were at least roughly familiar. And in addition to that, I've been a professor for 22 years, so I taught this, I know this, and I live this, and the book itself, start to finish, took about 3.5 years. But it's not fair to say because I had a head start.
She won't talk about time travel.
I would also like to mention, it's not just in journalism. I was in business.
Sure.
I think as a woman, you had to work twice as hard
So true.
to basically not reach because there was prejudice, why are you hiring him as a vice president? And I'm the administrative assistant.
I like to think of the book as really good career advice generally, that there are lots of examples in the book where you're going, oh, no, 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 don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. You know, it's sort of like that, or wow, what an interesting way to succeed, or wow, women had figured that out in 1840 and had gotten so far with this. But I think it's true across professions, and I hope the book comes across that way. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very enjoyable.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask a very loaded question.
Go ahead.
How does the Me Too movement influence women in your profession?
The way in probably every profession. So one thing we've seen is whenever there's an advance in progress, this is true in civil rights, this is true in just every area where progress is needed, that progress is almost always followed by backlash. And we see this over and over again. So in Me Too, we know a lot of wonderful careers of men, even men who have been very helpful to women, have suffered. And there's no way back into grace. So that holds in journalism and in other fields. But then what have we seen happening to women since then? We've seen a pillorying on the internet, in social media, that is so vicious and so beyond the pale, whereas you know, a man journalist being attacked for his ideas or, you know, issues that he's covering would be called an idiot or a hack, something like that. For a woman, it's her head emblazoned on some pornographic image and threats to rape her children. I mean, that's the difference in what happens between men and women in the same circumstances on the internet. And, you know, I mean, who can explain why people act the way they do on social media? But you see that variance, that backlash. I've heard people talk about the civil rights movement that way. I've heard Mark Whitaker talk about it, that, you know, he wrote a book recently about 1966 and the rise of the Black Panthers, and was talking about the backlash that comes after every moment of progress. And as he was speaking, I'm going, yeah, that's true for women too. I mean, that backlash is always going to come to pull back progress. So I think that's what I would say about that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Am I allowed to ask one more?
Sure.
Sure.
I have to wait for this.
Just quickly, just to follow up, you've mentioned a couple times you feel that women rising in the profession, it's a sign of, or it's because of the profession?
All I can tell you is the history.
No, but
I can just tell you, I just see it over and over again. So when I see the
You see what
progress
I'm
now,
gonna
I get a little nervous.
Yeah, so,
That's all.
so it feels like a profession in decline
Well, we know it's a profession in decline. We
because
know
of
that.
the other options that are out there. Everybody thinks they're a reporter.
Think about local news, what's happened to local newspapers. I mean, we have deserts all over the country. Think about even some of the great nonprofits, some have run into trouble recently where we've seen massive layoffs, and ones that we thought were really coming to the fore and were going to do great, not so great. You know,
Not to mention amongst...
and then look at television. I mean, look at what's happened to network television or cable television. I mean, they're in decline. You know, new disruption and new
When
forms.
there's finally a non-white anchor of the evening news,
There you go.
network evening news.
There you go.
Network evening news is losing audience. But one has to say it's also a mindset which we are suffering through, where people tend to believe only what they want to believe, see what they want to see, which makes it difficult to have healthy commercial journalism. So the economics, advertising being taken away by much more direct access online, that sort of thing, on the financial side.
Yeah.
And on the psychology side, I don't want to know what I don't want to know. I don't want to read what I don't want to read. You're giving me everything. I just want to talk to listen to the people who tell me what I agree with.
Mm-hmm.
It's and so we
It's a
know what the
really hard
most
time.
we know what the most successful cable news network is, although it's undergoing some changes now as well. So it's a combination of things which make it very difficult. I don't know about you. For me, to suggest to younger people that this is a great profession to learn things, meet people, make a difference, whether little or small.
I'll always say that, because I think if you want to be a journalist, nothing's going to stop you.
Well, that's true, and nothing is often
Yeah.
what you can. But it's it's been a great life for some of us, and
Sure has.
and the kids who persist with all of the fragmentation and all of the doubts and all of that, my hat is off to them. I have to say, I went to Columbia College, not the journalism school, and I've recently gotten a request from the student newspaper, the daily paper, The Spectator, to be a mentor.
Oh, fun.
And I said to myself,
Do it.
what can I tell these kids that's going to be useful to them in this
Truth and
environment?
justice. Just tell them.
But I think that I mean, things always change, but there's been a dramatic change in what makes good journalism and what makes journalism viable as a career. But I want to thank you again, Brooke.
I want to thank you, David, for asking me for the second time. Really sweet. And I want to thank the library and Yvette. And it's lovely to be here. I come from further east, from East Hampton, where I'm involved with the East Hampton Library. So support your local library. Really important.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.